In a time of fear and darkness, God called an unlikely man hiding in a winepress.
Gideon believed he was weak, but the Lord called him a mighty warrior.
With only 300 men, trumpets, torches, and jars, Gideon faced an army too large to count.
This is the story of courage, faith, and the victory that belonged to God. This is Gideon.
Crouched deep within the stone walls of the winepress, his knuckles white as he ground the wheat.
He moved with agonizing slowness, his breath hitched in his chest.
Every scrape of grain against stone sounded like a thunderclap in the oppressive stillness of the valley. He paused, pressing his back against the cool, damp rock, and glanced toward the horizon. The Midianite campfires dotted the dark landscape like a vast, cold sea of embers. They were everywhere. He looked down at his hands,
dust-caked and trembling, then back to the horizon where the enemy fires flickered in the wind.
The air felt heavy, stagnant with the scent of dry earth and impending ruin. He reached for another handful of wheat, but his fingers slipped. He froze, eyes fixed on the distant lights.
The world outside the winepress belonged to the invaders, and every movement he made was a gamble against discovery. He forced his hands to steady, his jaw tight, as he continued the work,
desperate to finish before the night turned fully against him. The wind shifted, carrying the faint,
rhythmic sound of enemy patrols, and he pressed himself lower into the shadows, waiting for the silence to return.
The air in the vineyard changed. It thickened, turning static and heavy, as if the very atmosphere were being compressed. The rhythmic sound of Gideon's grinding stopped mid-motion. A soft, radiant golden light began to pulse beneath the boughs of the ancient oak tree just outside his hiding place. It did not flicker like a fire or fade like a setting sun. It grew with a steady, impossible intensity that bleached the shadows from the stone walls.
Gideon froze, his hands still buried in the grain, his muscles locked in a sudden,
sharp paralysis. The darkness of the night seemed to recoil from the brilliance emanating from the tree. Then, the light coalesced. A figure sat within the glow, calm and immovable, his presence filling the small space with a weight that made the ground tremble. Gideon blinked, his eyes stinging, his breath catching in his throat. The figure did not move, but his gaze found Gideon in the corner of the press. The angel spoke, his voice resonating through the stone and soil like the deep, low tolling of a bell. "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." Gideon remained motionless, his hand gripping the wheat, his heart hammering against his ribs as the golden light illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air between them. Gideon did not bow, he did not kneel. He looked behind him, checking the empty corners of the winepress.
His brow furrowed in sharp, jagged disbelief. The weight of the title felt like an insult. He stood up, his legs shaking, and gestured broadly toward the desolate, ruined fields beyond the walls. His voice was not a whisper. It was a rough, broken sound, trembling with the bitterness of a man who had watched his life dissolve. "If the Lord is with us, why has this happened?" He spat the words out, his eyes darting to the blackened stumps of the vines and the scorched earth of the valley. "Where are the wonders our ancestors spoke of? Where is the strength they promised?" He took a step forward, his chest heaving, his hands pressed hard against the rough stone of the press. "The Lord has abandoned us to the fire and the blade. We are left to rot in the shadows while the enemy feasts on our harvest."
He stopped, his breath coming in ragged gasps, waiting for the light to dim or the figure to vanish. The golden glow did not flicker. It remained warm, immovable, and terrifyingly constant, pinning Gideon to the spot as his own anger echoed back at him from the dark, silent trees. The light intensified, casting long, sharp shadows across the floor of the press. The command came not as a question, but as a tectonic shift in the air. "Go in the strength you have. Am I not sending you?" Gideon stepped back, his heel catching on a loose stone. He stumbled, his chest rising and falling in shallow, jagged bursts. He looked down at his own hands, calloused, stained with the dust of the grain,
and trembling. He wiped them against his thighs, a frantic, repetitive motion that failed to clear the grime. "My clan is the weakest in Manasseh," he whispered, his voice cracking. He gestured to the press, to the meager pile of wheat, to the reality of his own insignificance. "I am the least in my family. How can you ask this of me?" He braced himself against the wall. eyes fixed on the floor,
waiting for the rebuke. Instead, the heat of the light pushed forward, surrounding him. The response was immediate, steady, and final. I will be with you. You will strike down the Midianites. The gravity of the promise hung in the silence. Gideon stopped moving. His hands went still. The weight of the words pressed into his shoulders, forcing him to confront the impossible task ahead. The stillness of the vineyard felt brittle, ready to snap. Gideon dropped to his knees, the hard, uneven ground biting into his skin. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He looked up, his jaw set, eyes searching the golden light for a flaw, a flicker,
anything to anchor his reality. If I have truly found favor, he said, his voice straining against the silence, give me a sign. Stay here. Do not move. He did not wait for an answer.
He scrambled to his feet, his boots kicking up dust as he pivoted toward his home. Every muscle in his legs burned with the sudden, violent shift into motion. He sprinted through the dark, his breath coming in sharp, ragged whistles. He bypassed the main entrance, crashing into the storage area to find a young goat. He dragged it out, grabbing a handful of flour for unleavened bread. He did not look back. He ran with the weight of the animal over his shoulders, his lungs searing, his mind fixed only on the rock in the vineyard. He had to return before the light vanished. He had to see if the promise was solid, or if it would dissolve the moment he arrived. Gideon skidded to a halt at the edge of the vineyard, his chest heaving, legs trembling from the sprint. He dropped the goat and the bread onto the flat, sun-bleached rock, his hands shaking as he arranged them. The light remained, pulsing with a rhythmic, golden hum that seemed to vibrate in the marrow of his bones.
He stepped back, wiping sweat from his eyes, and gestured toward the offering. The angel did not move toward him.
He simply reached out with his staff, the wood smooth and dark against the brilliance of his presence.
The tip touched the meat. Instantly, the air vanished. A roar of sound, like a furnace door swinging open, filled the space. Fire surged from the stone itself, not flickering but solid, a white-hot pillar that consumed the meat and bread in a single, violent flash. The heat was a physical blow, slamming into Gideon's face and forcing him to shield his eyes.
He stumbled, his heels catching on the uneven earth, and he went down hard, hitting the dirt with a thud. He lay there, gasping, the smell of scorched air thick in his throat. When he looked up, the light was gone. The silence of the night rushed back in, but the rock was blackened and cold. Gideon stared at the charred remains, his breath hitching, the weight of the moment finally anchoring in his chest. The terror that had pinned Gideon to the dirt evaporated. He pushed himself upright, his palms scraping against the grit of the vineyard floor. He stood alone in the dark, but the hesitation was gone. He walked back toward his home, his stride steady, his jaw locked. He found his 10 servants waiting in the shadows of the storehouse.
He did not speak. He pointed to the heavy iron hammers and steel axes resting against the wall.
They understood. They moved through the village in a tight, soundless line, avoiding the main paths where the embers of the campfires still glowed. The altar of Baal stood in the center of the square, a massive, imposing structure of stone and rotted timber. Gideon reached it first. He gripped the handle of his axe, the wood rough against his calloused skin. He measured the distance, caught the eye of his lead servant,
and swung. The iron head bit deep into the primary support beam. A sharp, violent crack of splintering wood echoed through the sleeping village. He pulled the axe back and struck again, the rhythm of destruction building with every blow.
The altar groaned under the weight of his resolve. By the time the final support gave way, the silence of the night was shattered, and the first step toward a new path was carved into the dust. Dawn light bled over the horizon, revealing the splintered wreckage in the square. The village erupted.
People poured from their homes, shouting, pointing at the ruin of the altar. They converged on the site, a wall of angry faces and raised fists. Gideon stood amidst the debris,
his grip still tight on the handle of his axe. The mob surged forward, a wave of noise and movement that threatened to swallow him. Then, a heavy hand slammed against the wooden fence, and a figure stepped between Gideon and the crowd. It was Joash. He stood firm, legs planted wide, his gaze cutting through the clamor of the villagers. He did not look at his son. He looked directly at the leaders of the mob. his posture immovable. When he spoke, his voice carried over the shouting, low and sharp. "You seek justice for a god?" He gestured toward the pile of smashed stone and wood. "If Baal is truly a god, let him defend himself." The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. The crowd faltered. The shouting died away, replaced by a sudden, cooling silence. They looked at the ruins, then at Joash, and the threat of violence dissolved into a confused, uneasy quiet. The power had shifted. The silence in the square was brittle, a thin film over a deep well of resentment. Gideon stood at the center of the ruins, his hands still trembling from the adrenaline of the dawn. Then the change came. It was not a sound, but a pressure, a sudden, rushing heat that climbed his spine and filled his chest. He felt the air grow thin, his muscles tightening with a strength that was not his own. He looked at the faces around him, no longer seeing enemies, but a people waiting for a spark. He reached to his side and unhooked the curved ram's horn from his belt. He held it for a moment, the rough texture of the bone pressing into his palm. He drew a breath that seemed to pull the very oxygen from the square, expanded his lungs, and pressed the horn to his lips. He blew. A single piercing note tore through the quiet, a sound so raw and commanding it shook the dust from the rooftops. It reverberated against the hills, a clarion call that cut through the fear of the valley. Across the fields, in the distant hamlets and hidden groves, men looked up. The signal had been given. From every direction, they emerged from the tree lines, clutching spears and staves, answering the call that had finally shattered the long night of their oppression. Thousands stood on the plains, a sea of bodies stretching toward the horizon. Gideon looked out over the throng, his pulse steadying as he saw the sheer scale of the force he had summoned. He felt the weight of their expectations. Then, the presence returned, heavy and absolute in the center of his mind. The voice did not offer encouragement. It offered a cold, hard truth. "You have too many men," it echoed. Gideon blinked, his gaze scanning the endless rows of soldiers. He opened his mouth to argue, but the words died in his throat. He looked back at the faces, some brave, some haunted, some simply waiting for a leader. He realized the truth. A crowd this large could not be moved by a single purpose. He stepped onto a raised mound of earth, his voice carrying over the murmuring thousands. "Whoever is afraid, turn back," he called. The effect was immediate. The back ranks wavered, then turned. Slowly at first, then in a steady, rhythmic retreat, the tide began to pull away. 22,000 men turned their backs on the conflict and walked toward the horizon. Gideon stood motionless, watching the numbers dwindle until the dust settled, leaving only 10,000 men in the clearing. A heavy, hollow silence replaced the roar of the assembly, leaving him alone with the few who remained. The 10,000 reached the spring by midday. The heat was stifling, the dust of the march clinging to every throat. Gideon stood back, his eyes fixed on the water's edge. The men surged forward, driven by an animal need to quench their thirst. The first wave hit the bank, their momentum carrying them down into the mud. They dropped their weapons into the dirt, eyes closing as they plunged their faces directly into the stream, oblivious to the world around them. Gideon watched them, his jaw tight. He shifted his focus, scanning the periphery of the group. A few men approached differently. They did not abandon their surroundings. They reached the bank and knelt with caution, eyes scanning the horizon. They scooped the water with one hand, bringing it to their mouths while their other hand remained gripped around their spears. They were drinking, yet they never stopped watching. Gideon moved among them, noting the tension in their shoulders and the way their ears tracked the distant sounds of the valley. The gap between those who surrendered to the moment and those who remained ready was absolute. Gideon stood silently, his gaze lingering on the alert few, witnessing the divide that would soon dictate the fate of the entire mission. Gideon walked the length of the bank, his hand gesturing toward the men who had remained vigilant. He called them out one by one, gathering the 300 who had kept their eyes on the horizon while they drank. The others, thousands of them, stood confused as they were ordered to return to their tents. Gideon watched the large group slowly disperse, their footsteps fading into the distance until the valley floor felt cavernous and empty. He turned back to the remaining 300. They stood in a tight, silent cluster. Gideon counted them again, his lips moving as he verified the number. 300. He looked out toward the distant ridge where the enemy camp lay hidden, then back at his small, motionless force. The contrast was impossible to ignore. He gripped his spear, his knuckles turning white as he felt the sheer weight of the task ahead. There was no room for error, no margin for exhaustion. The wind picked up, swirling the dust around their feet, and Gideon stood tall, forcing the fear back into the depths of his chest. He turned his face toward the night, waiting for the final command to move.
Gideon moved with his servant through the tall, dry grass, every step deliberate and silent. They stayed low, bodies pressed into the earth as they crawled toward the ridge. The air grew warmer,
thick with the smell of wood smoke and roasting meat. As they crested the rise, Gideon stopped. Below them, the valley floor had vanished. It was replaced by a sea of light. Thousands of campfires stretched toward the horizon, an endless grid of glowing embers that flickered like fallen stars. The sound reached them next, the low, rhythmic thrum of thousands of voices, the clatter of metal, and the occasional burst of raucous laughter that echoed off the canyon walls. Gideon gripped the dirt, his fingers sinking into the dry soil. He looked at his servant, who was staring down at the massive sprawl with eyes wide and unblinking. The sheer magnitude of the enemy force was a physical weight. It was impossible to count them. They were a tide, a vast, suffocating presence that made his own 300 men seem like dust in the wind. Gideon felt his breath catch in his throat, his heart drumming against his ribs as he stared into the heart of the abyss.
They crept closer, sliding behind a stack of supply crates near the camp perimeter. A low murmur drifted from two guards, huddled by a dimming fire. Gideon held his breath, straining to catch the words over the snapping of the logs. "I had a dream," the first guard whispered, his voice tight with an unnatural tremor. "A loaf of barley bread tumbled into our camp. It struck the tent, and the whole structure collapsed into the dust." The second guard leaned forward, the firelight catching the hollow look in his eyes. "That is nothing but the sword of Gideon.
The Lord has delivered us into his hands." Silence followed, heavy and suffocating. Gideon pressed his back against the rough wood of the crate, his eyes locking onto his servant in the dark. He felt the cold dread that had gripped his chest for days snap and fall away. His muscles stopped trembling. His jaw set into a hard, immobile line. He did not need to see more. He touched his servant's arm and gestured toward the shadows, moving back with a new, lethal precision. The terror had shifted sides. Gideon was no longer a man running from a tide. He was the blade already at their throats. Gideon returned to the darkness where his 300 waited. He did not speak. He moved among them,
Pressing objects into their palms. A hollow clay jar, a ram's horn trumpet, a torch.
its flame extinguished but the wick ready. The men took the items, their fingers tracing the unfamiliar shapes in the gloom. They looked to him, questioning, but Gideon only gestured toward the perimeter. He divided them into 3 companies. One by one, they melted into the darkness,
moving with the precision of shadows. No steel clattered against stone, no boots crunched on dry brush.
They navigated the ravines and the slopes, spreading out until they formed a ring around the vast, sleeping camp. Gideon took his position, his hand tightening around the cold,
smooth neck of the clay jar. The air grew thin. Every man stood motionless, breath held,
waiting for the signal. The enemy camp lay below, a sprawling ocean of unaware targets. Gideon watched the flickering embers, his heartbeat the only rhythm in the absolute, crushing silence. The circle was complete. The trap was set. He raised his hand, and the world held its breath. Gideon's hand hung suspended in the air. He drew a sharp, deep breath and pressed the ram's horn to his lips.
He blew. The sound was not a call to battle. It was a jagged, piercing scream that tore through the stagnant night air. Instantly, from 300 points around the perimeter, the sound of impact followed. 300 clay jars struck stone and earth in a single, thunderous crash. The sound was absolute. It was the grinding of clay, the snap of brittle walls, and the sudden release of trapped air. The darkness, which had been a heavy shroud moments before, was now shredded by the cacophony. The vibration of the trumpets seemed to rattle the very ground beneath the enemy's feet. Every man in the camp jolted awake to a wall of sound that hit them like a physical force. There was no time to think, no time to reach for a weapon, and no time to locate the source. The air was thick with the ringing of brass and the crunch of broken pottery. The silence was dead, buried under a violent, unrelenting roar that echoed against the valley walls, turning the night into a trap of pure, deafening noise.
The final echo of the shattering clay had barely faded when the second phase of the trap ignited.
300 hands reached out. 300 flames flared into existence at the exact same second, as if the darkness itself had been set on fire. The light did not merely glow, it surged,
casting long, frantic shadows that danced against the canvas tents of the enemy. From every ridge, from every hidden depression in the slopes, the circle of fire tightened.
To the men waking in the camp, it appeared as though a vast, invisible army had materialized from the very earth.
The light caught the metal of the trumpets and the glint of movement,
multiplying the 300 into a perceived legion of thousands. The orange illumination turned the valley into a stage of blinding motion.
Everywhere the Midianites looked, they saw the same brilliant, encroaching ring of flame. The illusion of an unstoppable, surrounding force took hold instantly.
The camp was no longer a place of sleep, but a brightly lit cage. The torches held steady,
their flames whipping in the wind, holding the entire valley in a grip of absolute, undeniable light. The light had done its work, but the sound was the breaking point. Gideon stood on the ridge,
his lungs filling to capacity. He roared, his voice cutting through the valley like a blade. For the Lord and for Gideon, 300 throats joined him, a singular massive wall of sound that vibrated the very air.
It was not a call for combat. It was a proclamation of doom. The Midianites, caught in the blinding glare of the torches, could not see the size of the force surrounding them.
They heard only the roar, a thunderous, unified cry that echoed from every direction at once.
Fear surged through the camp, raw and unthinking. A soldier lunged at a shadow, mistaking his own comrade for an attacker. The confusion cascaded. A blade flashed in the orange light, striking a tent mate. The cry of the attackers became the soundtrack to their self-destruction. The unity of the Midianite ranks shattered under the weight of the panic. They did not look for the enemy anymore. They looked for targets within their own lines.
The cry of the 300 continued, relentless and steady,
driving the enemy into a frenzy of blind, internal violence as the camp turned against itself in the dark.
The panic hit its peak, and the camp dissolved. Men tore through the tent walls, not seeking the exit, but clawing at the fabric to find any path away from the sound. Weapons were cast aside, clattering uselessly against the stones as warriors turned into a stampeding mob. They shoved past one another, desperate to outrun the imaginary legion that haunted the darkness behind them.
No blade from Gideon's men was ever drawn. The Midianites were their own undoing. They collided in the narrow lanes,
falling over supply crates and tripping in the mud, their fear so absolute that they became a human tide. The camp,
once a bastion of strength, became a graveyard of discarded gear and abandoned standards. As the last of the front line surged toward the valley edge, the center of the camp emptied, leaving behind only the smoldering remains of the fires and the echo of frantic, retreating screams. They spilled out into the shadows of the hills, a broken force fleeing a ghost. The valley floor, recently a theater of war, fell into a sudden, eerie stillness. The threat had evaporated, replaced by the hollow sound of thousands of men running into the black of night, never once turning back to see who had driven them out. Gideon remained on the ridge, his feet planted on the hard earth, watching the valley floor surrender its secrets to the morning. The frantic noise of the night had vanished, leaving only the sound of his own steady breathing. He stood immobile, his hands resting at his sides. As the first rays of the sun climbed over the eastern peaks, the golden light spilled into the basin, illuminating the wreckage of the camp. It was silent. The chaos had burned itself out, leaving the fields empty and the threat dismantled. He watched the shadows retreat, tracing the paths where thousands had fled in blind, unreasoning terror. There was no pride in his stance, only a heavy, grounding realization. He looked at the palms of his hands, the same hands that had ground wheat in fear, and felt the weight of what had occurred. It was not his strategy, nor his strength, that had hollowed out the enemy. He bowed his head, the wind brushing against his face as the last of his uncertainty dissolved in the morning air. A quiet, absolute awe settled deep in his chest. He stood as a witness to a power that moved beyond the reach of men, his gaze fixed on the horizon, anchored in the stillness of a peace he had never known before.
Like the video? Then like and subscribe to the channel. A glowing thumbs up shimmers as the red button pulses gently. Join our community today and ring the bell for more. We are waiting for you.